Hello, we are back for our latest episode of Boardroom RevOps, where we're bringing you valuable tips from RevOps experts so you can make it to the C-suite. I'm James, co-founder of Account Aim, the RevOps BI platform. Really excited to welcome Gabriel Rustice to the show today. He's a multi-time VP of RevOps, currently leading RevOps at Seedtag. Gabriel, welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Of course, it's good to have you on. I know we chatted a couple times in the past, and we're going to chat about a couple of things today that I think were really interesting topics that we had kind of spoken about previously. Forecasting a usage-based business. I think the seed tag business model in particular is kind of unique relative to typical SaaS, and then we'll also talk a bit about kind of building the modern go-to-market stack with all of this talk of AI and the things that are changing. So excited to talk about that. But first, why don't you share your background for folks?
Amazing, of course. Yeah. So I spent over the last 16 years, I've seen like different things, different companies, right? So I come from a public company like FedEx Express that was early on in my career. That was the beginnings of me stepping into the role of a sales operations analyst. I've seen VC-backed companies. So I worked for a company called Doc Planner, which is a global healthcare SaaS company. And then I also had two runs at private equity, kind of companies, including my current one, which we'll talk about topics related to that one. So that got me different points of view of how go-to-market teams operate, business models operate, and throughout that, like I learned a bunch about revenue operations. So I'll describe myself as a forever learner. So never stop learning something new, especially with the market changing so much. Also, always with this multinational background, right? So, born and raised in Brazil, been living in Spain, specifically Barcelona, for the past 11 years. Spent long seasons in Canada. Like when I say seasons, like entire winters, for projects and things of that nature. Families from Portugal, so like always, always in global roles, right? And I currently am the global VP of Revenue Operations at Seedtag, which is this ad tech, advertising technology business. And the way that I would describe it, what the company does is we are the technology or the AI layer between publishers and brands, right? So whenever brands are putting out ads on the internet and they want to make sure they contextualize whether the placement of those brands to the most optimized way. CTAG companies like CTAG, they're the best ones to go to.
Cool, super helpful, and a good segue right into kind of our first topic. Seed tag to me, I'm going to call it ad tech. Hopefully, I'm not wrong on that, but it's generally ad tech. But usage-based models are becoming obviously much more common and kind of hot right now, given like all of these AI companies that are selling on credits and things like that. Tell me, like, why is you've seen kind of more traditional business models, so why is like forecasting in a usage-based model like just fundamentally different than kind of traditional SaaS forecasting?
Yeah, and you're spot on with being an ad tech business as you're describing it accurately. Let's say so. The way that I like to think about it is, and I'll give proper credit when I quote it. So the guys from the winning by design revenue architecture, they speak a lot about the different types of revenue models, right? So there's even this chart that says, from left to right, you have ownership, you have, I think it's subscription or something of the sort, all the way through consumption or usage base. And like in the old days, companies would sell perpetual licenses. I work at a company that did that. And in the middle, like you have this subscription, which was the boom of SaaS. There's a lot of debate on where that's going in the future. And that kind of gives like the way that I like to look at it is that investors actually love a lot this business model because it gives predictability. Like you have a commitment from the customer, a legal commitment that they're going to renew unless something happens, right? And then you get to the far right of that chart. Then you have like these new companies, and this is where most companies nowadays I see they going, into that direction where there's no commitment, and that's where CTAG operates, and that's what makes it interesting and also challenging at the same time. So you're not going to have a contract that runs up in 12 months that is up for renewal, that you got an account manager or a CSM to just call the customer and say, are you happy? Can we continue through, right? And if they're happy, they're going to continue through. In some cases, companies wouldn't even call the customer, which I don't think is best practice, right? But that's kind of the predictability of a subscription-based business, or even perpetual when you're selling maintenance of that software versus usage-based. You rely a lot on signals, and the signals is what gives you a hint on how you can forecast the business. But again, you have no commitment, so you have to follow the data or follow the market to kind of get a glimpse of how you forecast the business.
Yeah, and I can see, I think it's probably fairly obvious like why this becomes so challenging. Like it's probably seasonal, it's company by company. There's probably macro things that can happen. There's micro things at the specific company level that might cause them to increase or decrease spend. So I imagine getting to some degree of predictability is really challenging here.
And added to that, then there's another component, you're spot on, but there's also another component in the case of Seedtag or an ad tech company. In our business, because we're in the advertising slash marketing business, any macro event that happens, brands or companies, usually where they cut budgets, that's the first option, right? It's marketing
Yeah.
expenditure, right? So you have also that, that added element, right, which makes it challenging. So you have uncontrolled variables that are directly affecting your quarter or even month forecast, right?
So I think obviously like the goal here would be to get to like predictive analytics. I think from a data analytics perspective, like predictive models is always kind of like the goal. That sounds really hard to me in this type of like models. Like, what are the fundamentals folks need to get in place first when like forecasting usage-based business before we can even think about like predictive models and the like?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I learned over the course of time is getting the basics right in a company is underrated. And this is one of the topics that I talk a lot about with uh, someone that probably I would say a big chunk of the listeners of this podcast would even recognize. So there's a guy named Marcus Benning. He's a senior RevOps leader based in EMEA, spent multiple years in North America. And we talk a lot about ensuring that companies have a rhythm of the business. They document how things get done, and being very prescriptive with it, right? And that foundational layer, if you don't do that right, then putting a lot of data science on top of it won't cut it, right? Won't fly, right? It's the same as building a house, right? And you're putting all of the Alexa stuff, like all of the gadgets, but you don't have like a roof, right? So you have to make sure you have a roof first, right, and a floor. And so the way that and we've been doing this at Seedtag. So as the company scales, one fundamental aspect is even getting to the level, like I'll give a specific example here, down to the level of, do all of the sales leaders, VPs, country managers, or even sellers, right? Do they know like the precise formula of how to make a judgment call, of a forecast call, right? There has to be a formula, right, that maps out to your Salesforce opportunities, right? Do they have that clearly written down? Because obviously everybody in a company comes from different backgrounds, so they have their own knowledge, right? But ultimately the company needs a rhythm and it needs consistency, right? So I would say that's your go-to, is the first thing you have to do, is to ensure there is that level of documentation, rhythm of the business. Once those things are in place, then you can jump into more advanced stuff.
Tell me more about the forecasting definition example. I think it's really interesting. Like, why is that so important in your experience to have everyone kind of aware of?
Yeah, I think one of the things I like to think about it, if you take, for example, unrelated to SaaS, but if you take the Christian faith as a random example here, right? It was something that was passed down generation from generation, coming all the way through the ancient people of Israel. And then you have like the stories, of Jesus and his disciples 2,000 years ago. Imagine all of that if it was just passed down without it being documented, like with diligence, right? With down to the level of, this is what happened in the era of this king of the, right, over the course of generations, right? So I see the same happens in a company where no matter how great the company is, if you're operating with more than 10 people in a room, you should be doing this. And an example would be the way that we like to think about it at Seedtag is our forecast formula is basically taking three elements. So it's taking, and there's an aspect here of a business model, but I'll just cut to the chase, which is, here's your closed active business. In the ad tech business, that is very important, because even the closed one keeps varying up and down. So it's not like a traditional SaaS company where you sold it, it gets done, it gets delivered, right? So we have that extra variability. So we take the closed, right? We take the weighted pipeline. So here's your open revenues, let's say, Salesforce opportunities, if you will. And then there's methodologies behind it, how to set the probability behind it. And then you have your judgment call that gets applied on top of it. And for each of these components, then you have a slide deck that breaks it down specifically how that gets calculated. Right? So you take the closed revenues. Again, in the case of Seedtag, there's variability in because brands are investing day in and day out, and it's up to them to invest. So we follow the pacing of those campaigns that they're investing in. So there's a particularity here that needs to be documented into how that number, becomes a data point in your slide, right? The same goes for the weighted pipeline. Then you have a breakdown of that. Like you have a slide that goes into the details. This is your sales process, your sales stages, your forecast categories, and this is how it gets calculated. Everybody knows it. And then ultimately, even the judgment call, and we're in active discussions about it. How do you actually look at those data points and then look at the market, discussions with clients, and then come up with a judgment on whether you're going to keep the same number as you see in your Salesforce, whether you're going to, add future revenues that are not yet in pipe, or you're going to downgrade because you're not trusting, the market these days, right? So I envision this in a practical way as like 5 to 10 slides where you have the formula, and then for each of the components that I just described, you go through and you say specifically this is the math behind it, and then everybody in the company shows up on a weekly call, right? So they have their pipeline reviews, they have their forecast reviews. It goes all the way to the CRO and to the board, where a number gets shared, and you have all of this behind it.
I love this. I think it clearly sounds pretty complex, and so I think being able even to just give managers who probably don't have the time to like think about this, like the gold standard of how we should be thinking about this, is like incredibly helpful. And I can see without that kind of rigor that like these things would just fall over and it'd be like a little bit like finger in the air, right?
Exactly. And that's very common, like not only to the Seedtag business, but think of any company, like even a SaaS company that has more predictability, where you have a contract that renews. Still, like a sales leader is applying their own judgment, and that judgment could be different depending on their background, depending on how busy they are, right? So if you don't have that
Yeah.
prescriptive way of operating, how can you then stand behind a forecast that you give to the board, right?
Totally. Yeah, that's great. You mentioned the word pacing. And in a past life, I worked at Indeed.com, which also bought Glassdoor, which is also basically an ad tech company for like job advertising ultimately. And the concept of pacing here was very important. But I don't know if it's a well understood term to folks that haven't had direct experience. Like, tell me what pacing is generally and like how this ties to like the forecast.
That's a very good point. Thanks for calling that out. So in our business, at least, again, brands are running campaigns. Sort of think of the stock exchange, right? So where you buy and sell stocks all the time. So brands like think of P&G, think of Coca-Cola, the Coca-Cola company, Sony. All of these brands, they're investing in advertising, and the way that they do invest is through kind of a marketplace, through an ad exchange, we call it. And so because they're actively operating themselves through a platform in a very similar way that the stock exchange, and that the contracts that they sign or do not sign, sometimes there is not even a contract, don't guarantee that they're going to invest. So let's say they promise you $1 million, but it may be that tomorrow they shut off the campaign and that's it, right? That's why it's fundamental that once they start to invest, you're kind of observing the rhythm of that investment. Are they actually pacing day by day, against the target that they've given us? And this is very valuable to us, because if they have to execute, let's say, $1 million in 3 months, and then we see that in 2-3 weeks they haven't invested $1, they're not going to get there, right? And same goes for, in some cases they're overpacing, we call it. So we're watching the day over day investment coming out of the ad platforms, and we see they're over investing. They're actually spending 2x, 3x, 4x the supposed to be amount, right? That gives us an indication that, hey, even though we were forecasting $1 million, there's very good chances we're going to end up at twice as that, right? And that is critical for us to actually come back internally and then assess in our judgment call. And so pacing is a fundamental aspect, I would say, to any company that operates in this space where you have a consumption-based business model, right? I think there's even more signals outside of that, and it depends on the business model where you're tracking how the users are interacting with your product. In the case of an ad tech business, the way that we see the most, let's say, predictive leading indicator is around pacing.
Yeah, makes sense. Real quick, I wanna get into like the modern go-to-market stack soon, but like two more questions. First, to round out like kind of the basics and the foundation here, how do you structurally set up pacing? Is this flowing into the CRM? Is this a big Excel sheet that dumps out of like a product database you have, and you have a person kind of manning this daily or weekly? Like how does this work operationally?
Great question. So in our case, the kind of the exchange that I just alluded to, where clients themselves are operating. So it's not Seedtag that is actually taking the contract and delivering on that revenue. It's the client who goes into a Google platform, into another third-party platform, and starts executing. Right? We're basically pulling the revenues from those platforms, and then that goes straight into our Salesforce. Right? So it goes into a database. From a database, it gets ETL and then upload it to Salesforce on a daily basis. And then inside of a Salesforce, we have actually a formula field that calculates the average of last 7 days and the daily spend, so that we have actually even that rolling up to the forecast field, right? So
Cool.
the formula that I alluded to previously in this conversation.
Yeah, awesome. That's super interesting, and it sounds like it's running fairly smoothly. Cool. Last piece here. Okay, so we talked a lot about the basics. I think like data hygiene, pacing, data connectivity, a clear forecast formula that's well kind of documented and understood and bought into from everyone, rolling it up to kind of like executives on the board. Tell me about like what does the next level of forecasting for a usage based business look like? I don't know if this is predictive analytics or something else. Like can folks kind of take this to the next level and get some good accuracy or kind of see the future?
Yeah, great point. For us, definitely the next level is moving just beyond the basics and then applying predictive analytics. And I say this because not only we have the nature of the business that is high variability, let's say, as I just went through the examples here, but on top of that, also we have relatively short sales cycles. So depending on the market, that might be 2 to 4 weeks, three to
Yeah.
five weeks. Um, and those two things compound into lack of visibility. And when you have lack of visibility, it doesn't matter how much effort you put into watching pacing, because all you can see is the next month or the next month and a half. So how do you come to the board and say, here's my quarter forecast? Not to say even you're coming up with an annual plan, right? And
Yeah.
so it starts with obviously the foundations of, you have good view of your TAM, you're planning your accounts on a yearly basis, you know where the market is going, but specifically to how do you up level your forecast, I would say uh, like predictive analytics is all about having high volume data that give you the signals onto where you're going, right? Because ultimately there is a Gauss curve of even a specific range and I'll give you an example of that, right? So we have markets like in Latin America where there's a super high ratio of opportunities that get created and closed within the same day. And that is often coming just by the nature of the business, where agencies, they come to you and say, hey, here's the briefing, I want to execute. And they're often like small campaigns, right? So it's transactional kind of business opportunities, right? And so you don't have kind of that visibility. So how do you operate in that model? Well, then it basically, like the way that we're thinking about this is, um, in an actual example we've seen is how much of your revenue, you can look back in time, analyze the last 2-3 years of your data, how much of your revenue of the end of the period, end of the month, or end of the quarter came from opportunities that were created and closed on day one, right? Versus how much we went after during the course of the quarter or the period, right? Versus how much was postponed and pulled. And that's going to give you a ratio by market. And then that's also going to give you the max capacity historically, right? So I'll give you an example. Brazil has never historically, started the quarter or the month with less than, I'll just name something completely random. It's not a factual data point, but less than 50% of revenues. Well, if your forecast call is saying 30% of that, right? So then you're off of, right? So you don't have any data to back it up, right? So ultimately there's a model, and I see opportunity for a data scientist to come in and analyze it. And this is where we're currently, we have a project, specifically around that. That would say, this is the range based on the data where you're likely to fall within, sorry. And then on top of that, then you go in and you apply the judgment. Ultimately, you can definitely beat the trend. We're not saying you cannot beat the trend, right? But you have to have high evidence. Maybe there's a major deal that will drop.
Yep.
There's something in the market that will, swing your judgment. but all of the data will help you model at least this is the range you're going towards too.
Yeah, that's awesome. This is great. I thought we could maybe you should have talked the whole episode about forecasting usage-based business, but I also want to talk about like the modern go-to-market stack because I know you guys are doing some really interesting stuff here. So thank you for that walkthrough, and we'll kind of switch gears here. So I think you said 16 years in like sales and RevOps for you. I think you spent a lot of your career around systems too. Everyone knows listening that for a long time, like the CRM was the center of the universe and everything. Like tell me a little bit like what you're saying, like what's changing now relating to that.
Yeah. So this is a topic that I've been reflecting over lately. Meaning you have to understand like where I'm coming from, like somebody who's been in and around revenue operations for 15 years plus, who's coming from that background of building systems and BI and data. That my philosophy has always been the CRM is the source of truth, and you have to kind of have that as a fundamental. And for me to be able to come up to a show like this and say, I think that's changing, and there might be a future, and emphasis on the might is like really a big deal, right? So it's not something I would have said 5 years ago, right? But this is what I see it's changing is that you know building is becoming so easy and more accessible to to the regular citizen, that the decision on build versus buy, the balance, like the weight is shifting, right?
Yeah.
Historically, it would always be like, well, let's just buy something, or let's always stick to, and for a lot of time, actually, there was a lot of debate on what is the best CRM? Is it Salesforce? Is it HubSpot? And even though there's still that debate going around, one thing that I've always heard from many of my peers is none of those are perfect. And actually, one thing that they fail is that they actually don't are not they're not designed for the front line. Right? So they're not the
Mhm.
system of action, right? And so that's kind of the shift that is happening in the market that I see is that building is becoming much easy, less costly, and especially with so much unstructured data, um, I see a future where you can operate with a headless CRM. So you have a database, you're extracting all of these signals coming from the front line of the go-to-market, and then you're working through AI and through applications that help your teams execute in a much faster and efficient way than traditional CRMs that you have to click through a lot of fields to save and put validation rules in place, right? That's definitely a future that I see us moving towards too.
So what do you think? I know you can't see the future, and I think it'll be really interesting to see over the next X years. I don't know how many it's going to take, but what would a headless CRM be? So you mentioned like backend database. I can imagine a Snowflake or even like an account name or something that's like holding a lot of all of the signals that you connect. That could be like email transcript or emails, call transcripts, deal data, etc. And then like are insights that reps need being sent out to them via like Slack? Like, what does a headless CRM actually like
Yeah.
mean in your vision?
Yeah. I think in a way, the conceptually is the same thing, right? If you strip away what a CRM currently is, right? So you have a database, right? So you have a system of record, and then you have the UI or the system of action part of it, which is you design workflows and stages and validation rules to ensure your teams are executing and you have guardrails in place, right? If you strip away all of that part, then conceptually the future could be, and I'm not saying necessarily this is going to happen, but conceptually, what prevents us from operating in a world where the database is an actual database, right? So underneath Salesforce and HubSpot, et cetera, there is a database with tables, right? And unique IDs where you're matching the tables so that you can do reporting on it. And then your system of action is an agent, is an application, is something that is actually specifically and intentionally designed for the front line and for the company to operate. So I see it kind of in the future, kind of agentic layers sitting on top of a database. And then I'm working, if I'm a seller or if I'm an executive, a CRO, then perhaps I don't even have a system to go to. I'm working on Slack or on my email. I pull up an agent or even my regular, let's say ChatGPT, Claude, any other kind of LLM, and then through MCP, through any other methodology. Here I'm thinking on the fly, that would then connect to, like, I'm talking to this client, I'm executing this or that, I need to find this resource, and then it connects the dots for me instead of actually
Yeah.
clicking through.
It really does feel inevitable to me, something similar to that vision. I do wonder, at accounting, we spend all our time thinking about data and there's so many nuances, et cetera. And we actually spend a lot of time with folks like getting to their source of truth. I do wonder how that source of truth is going to be solved because there is that
Hmm.
layer of like governance, right? And it's so easy to pull the wrong ARR number or the wrong filters on something. And so I'm sure someone will solve it, but that'll be definitely an interesting piece to tie that vision together.
Exactly. I think we're at a point where um, a transformation is about to happen. I think we're seeing that the old ways of working, they are not going to work in the future. Now, this specific design of the solution, we're yet to see.
Yeah, for sure. You talked about like modern tools, Claude. I think everyone's very aware right now, like are letting folks build things, faster, easier than before. Like, what kinds of systems are you seeing folks prototype today that used to, take big budgets or months? I mean, are you seeing anything, whether it's at your company or other folks you chat with?
I mean, I can say, at least from a first-hand example, because I see out there, I see a lot of, um, at least the examples that I know of out in the market and in communities that I'm part of, they're like more or less the same. They're like transcribing, calls and triggering actions in your CRM. There's other specific use cases, right? So, um, I'm not yet seeing like a proven playbook on something completely innovative, and the examples that I see are more or less the same. But first-hand examples, one of the key challenges that we face at Seedtag, and this was kind of a weekend project for me, was that uh, half of our client conversations, they're not happening over Zoom or Google Meet. They are face to face, right?
Hmm.
So even the most well-known use case for AI for go-to-market, which is extracting those signals from the conversations and automating the CRM entry, kind of doesn't work for us, right? It's not enough, right? And something I did like in a weekend, and it's prototype and a pilot, was actually to build a voice note app on Lovable, connecting through Claude, that actually did something similar. So as soon as you wrap up a client conversation, you took them for dinner, or you actually just met at an event, the seller could record a voice note in 30 seconds in any language. It could be because we operate in a global environment. And then two things that were amazing for me is that one of them, it would do obviously the basics of transcribing that, extracting the signals, populating the CRM. But also the second thing is, even if I kept changing fields on my Salesforce, right, creating new fields, new pick list values, right, then AI would figure that out and then say, oh, there's a new value here. So now this new meeting type is available, and I think it matches this, right? So that's, I think, the real unlock. And certainly in past occasions, like we spend weeks or months or big budgets on use case like this.
That's awesome. That's so cool and amazing that you built it in a weekend. That's awesome. So, sadly, we're just about at time here, Gabriel. This has been great. My last kind of question for you is like, we talked about headless CRM, some of the things that are coming up. Like if you were starting over, let's say new company, there's not any tech debt or operational debt that is so common when joining a new company, but you're starting a new company. If you were kind of going to design a modern go-to-market stack today from scratch, like what are the principles you would kind of think about to make sure everything stays cohesive, while also kind of preparing for like this new world?
I think the principles, they were and they keep being the same, which is similar to the forecasting. Focus on the basics. So before you go into tooling, make sure you figure out your go-to-market strategy. Make sure you're looking into, this is our total addressable market. Make sure you have a process on how to reach customers. Make sure you have fair quotas. You have your model around revenue and capacity figured out. Make sure you have mapped out how you want teams to operate. Like, do you want a full account managers? Do you want CSMs? Do you want SDRs? And how are the handshakes are going to work throughout that journey, right? If you really do have that clearly documented, then you can design your systems based on that. And then the principles for designing that system is keep it simple, avoid too many systems, right? Avoid too many things or too many isolated aspects, right? Point solutions here and there. Do make an effort to always like one database, two or three systems, right? Instead of buying point solutions, right? And always making sure you have a BI layer behind it. And just if you happen to be around looking for one, maybe this guy that is on a podcast can sell you something that is kind of a great tool.
I'm always down to sell someone something. So thank you for the plug. Gabriel, this was awesome. I think it's one of my favorite conversations in a while. Thanks so much for joining me, man.
Appreciate it. It was a pleasure.